Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 25th of August 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. We will begin today's discussion with two news articles appearing on page number 9 and 10. On page number 9, a news item appears, DNA bill can be misused, flags draft report. And similarly on page number 10, Parliamentary panel calls DNA bill premature. Both these two news items deal with an important bill which was first tabled in 2018, but later on it was again reintroduced in 2019 without any changes, and that is DNA Technology Regulation Bill. Now from the perspective of UPSC examination, it is very important to cover these bills, not just from the perspective of prelims examination which deals with the basic features and the important provisions of the bill, but also from the perspective of mains examination which requires us to analyze the provisions of the bills, highlight the issues, and along with that suggest measures. So we'll begin the discussion by first understanding the DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid. So as we all know that almost all the living species contain a set of instructions on the basis of which they function, and that is known as DNA or RNA. So in case of humans, we have DNA as the basic code which instructs all the functions as well as growth and development of an organism. So we can say that DNAs are a set of instructions found in each cell and they are used for the growth and development of an organism. Now there are a lot of things to be known and learned about DNA, but the most relevant information regarding DNA is that each person in this world has a unique DNA, and hence variation in the sequence of DNA can be used to match individuals and identify them. So just like we use fingerprinting for identification because we believe that almost every individual in this world has a different and a unique fingerprint. Although there are certain similarities, but that is very rare. But in case of DNA, the sequences in which the bases of the DNAs are arranged is different for each and every individual in this world, and hence DNA technology is one of the most trusted technology when it comes to identification of individuals, and hence it allows for accurate establishment of individuals' identity. So just to give you an idea as to how diverse the application of DNA technology can be, starting with criminal investigations. DNA based technologies can be used to aid criminal investigations. For example, the identity of a criminal offender may be determined by matching DNA found at the crime scene with the DNA of suspect. Also, in various instances, for example in disasters and terrorist attack, it becomes very difficult to identify the victims because the corpses of the victims often leaves little scope of physical identification. Hence, DNA-based technologies helps in identification of victims in these events. The best example is the extensive use of DNA technology for the identification of victims of terrorist attacks on World Trade Center in 2001, or famously known as 9/11 attacks. Apart from these, there is a wide application of DNA technologies in civil matters as well. You must have heard the disputes related to parentage and property because the lineage of a person is often disputed, and hence DNA profiling is often used and can be used in civil matters such as parentage related disputes. So these are just an example to illustrate the significance of DNA technology in various matters related to law. But the problem is that currently all these uses of DNA technology is unregulated. There is no law or set of rules to govern how DNA technology will be used. What shall be the rules and procedures which shall guide the utilization of DNA technology? And of course, if there is no law, there is no authority to oversee the implementation of DNA technology. And hence, in the past, several expert groups, including the Law Commission, have recommended a legal framework to regulate this particular field. And hence, in this regard, DNA Technology Regulation Bill 2018 was introduced in Lok Sabha, and later on it was reintroduced in 2019. So let us go through the highlights of the bill or the main provisions of the bill. So of course, as the name suggests, the bill regulates the use of DNA technology for establishing the identity of persons in respect of matters listed in schedule of the draft bill itself. So there is a schedule, or you can say a list, given in the bill itself. So all those matters which are given in the schedules of the act, the DNA technology or the DNA profiling can be applied in those cases. They deal with both criminal as well as civil matters, as we have understood in the introduction. Now, as we saw that since there is no legal framework, there is no authority, and hence the bill establishes two kinds of bodies. The first is National DNA Data Bank and the second one is DNA Regulatory Board. Now you need to understand that the DNA profiling or the profiling of a DNA of a person shall not be conducted by either data bank or regulatory board. They shall be conducted by independent labs. Now after the conduct of the test, once the sequence of a person is known, labs shall transfer that data to these data banks. And every data bank will maintain various kinds of indices. For example, crime scene index for cataloging all the genetic sequences obtained from a crime scene, then under trial or suspect index, offenders index, missing persons index, and unknown deceased persons index. For example, if a police gets a dead body not claimed by anyone, then the police may dispose of the body according to the ritual and just collect a DNA sequence. After some time, if the police is approached by the family of the deceased person, the DNA can be matched and it can be found out that whether the person dead was their relative or not, and there is no need to keep the dead body in the mortuary perpetually. So the data shall be categorized into various indices and stored at National DNA Data Bank as well as regional DNA data banks. Now when we talked about the labs, we did not talk about the accreditation, because there needs to be a proper set of procedures and standards to be followed by these labs, because they are ultimately testing and profiling a very important aspect of human existence, and that is DNA. And hence it is very important that they be regulated, and hence the bill establishes DNA Regulatory Board for accreditation of these labs. Every DNA laboratory that analyzes a DNA sample to establish the identity of an individual has to be accredited by the board. Now another important aspect of this particular bill is the need or a requirement of a written consent of a person whose DNA profiling is to be done. Now this is a very important aspect of privacy itself. You cannot force a person to provide his or her DNA sample, and hence a written consent is a must. If he says no, that means a no. But the bill also provides for an exception at the same time. So for example, consent is not required for offenses with punishment of more than 7 years of imprisonment or death. So in those cases where the crimes are obviously very heinous, then the consent of the individual is not at all required. But in all other matters, the consent is required. Now you can easily think of the wide utilization of DNA technology and the massive data which will be created. Also, such data shall be stored in national DNA data banks. So what about that data once it has no utility? For example, once we have established the identity of a person, why do we need the data after that? And hence, for that, the bill also provides for removal of DNA profiles by data banks. So the bill provides for the removal of data profiles of suspects on various grounds. So for example, The data of a suspect can be deleted if police files such a report that they no more need such data. Also, court can order the deletion of data. And in other matters, for example in civil matters or in matters of dead persons or missing persons, if the families and relatives of such persons make a written request, then on such request the data can be removed or shall be removed by the national DNA data banks as well as regional DNA data banks. So these are the important provisions of the bills. There are other provisions as well. For example, the bill also provides for penalties and punishments in case of misuse of the provisions of the bill or not following the procedures established by the bill. There are other provisions as well. But from the perspective of prelims and mains examination, these are the important provisions which can be memorized and also can be reproduced in the examination. Let us now understand the major issues with these provisions. The first and foremost concern deals with that of diagnostic centers. For example, under the bill, any laboratory that undertakes DNA testing must get accreditation from DNA Regulatory Board, right? We saw in the important provision. So currently, laboratories also carry out DNA testing for medical research or for diagnostic purposes. For example, diagnostic laboratories use DNA testing to check whether an individual may be diagnosed with a particular disease, for example, cancer or Alzheimer's disease. Now they do not use DNA technology to establish the identity of a person, but still they are dealing with DNA technology and they can in some cases. So given the purpose of the bill as stated in the introduction, it is unclear whether the bill intends to regulate DNA laboratories that conduct DNA testing for medical purposes or not. So we can say that this is a grey area of the bill. Now the second important aspect is that DNA profiling can reveal extremely sensitive information. And they may include information other than the identification itself. You know that a DNA sample will provide additional information about an individual other than his or her identity itself. And bill does not specify that information other than identity will not be included in a DNA profile. So just make this point more clear. DNA is a very long sequence of bases. The purpose of identification can be served by looking at only a smaller section of the sequence. But in case of complete DNA profile, 100% of the DNA is sampled. So while DNA can establish the identity of a person, its analysis will also reveal information related to a person's medical and physical characteristics, which obviously could impact his or her privacy. Then a lot of secondary data related to genetics, pedigree, skin color, behavior, diseases, health status of that person shall also be revealed. Obviously, one can argue that if the purpose of DNA profiling is to identify a person, why do we need to collect the profile of 100% DNA? Now, next important aspect cannot be ignored, especially in Indian context. Now, first and foremost is that under the provisions of the bill, access to such information can be misused to specifically target individuals and their families with their own genetic data. And this is particularly worrisome as it could even be used to incorrectly link a particular caste and community to criminal activities. And just like the caste system, the criminal behavior or the nature of a person can be attributed to a particular sequence in a DNA. And all the persons having the similar sequence in their DNAs can be stereotypes. And hence the possibility of social stereotyping cannot be ignored, especially if the DNA technology comes to be adopted at a much wider level. Then there are various issues related to the storage of the data itself. We have seen that the bill creates a lot of indices. For example, crime scene index, under trial index, offenders index, missing persons index, and unknown deceased persons index. Now, one of the arguments which have been raised against the provisions of the bill is that it's okay to collect and store the DNA profile of offenders or the persons who have been proven guilty in the court of the law. But there is no need to store and preserve the DNA profiles of crime scene investigations under trial people because of the simple reason that storage of DNA profile of offenders will help us track down the cases of repeat offenders. But the people who are under trials and the DNA collected from the crime scene investigation might need to unwanted hounding of people who are not related to the crime itself. Then comes the issue of data protection. You must have heard this debate with respect to the social media and online data. But creation of such massive data bank dealing with most private information, that is the DNA sequence, the question arises that will that data bank be safe? Because of course that data bank shall be digital. In the absence of a robust data protection legislation, the safety and the security of the data of so many individuals dealing with their DNA profiles cannot be taken for granted. And hence again coming back to the issue of indices, if you have a look at the indices, there is no index which deals with the profiling of civil matters. Hence the bill provides for DNA profiles in civil matters but does not provide a clear-cut and separate index in case of data banks to preserve the DNA profiles related to civil matters. Also, in cases of civil matters, why do we even need to preserve the data? For example, if you want to establish the parentage of a person, that can be done even without the storing of the data. Because in that case, DNA profile of 2 or 3 people have to be taken and the relationship has to be established, which can be done instantaneously by the software, and there is no need for storage. So these are the matters which needs to be looked into. And from the perspective of mains examination, there is a need to suggest way forward as well. And the reasons why we have discussed these issues is to enable you to suggest way forwards. And hence, corresponding to each issues, you can easily suggest way forwards. For example, there is a need to clarify whether the diagnostic centers will or shall come under the purview of this bill or not. Because if this thing is not clarified, diagnostic centers will always remain in regulatory confusion. There is a need to curtail the use of DNA profiles for establishing the identity of a person. So if the identity of people can be established by selected sequences, why is there a need to completely profile the DNA sequences? Because then they are going to reveal a lot of data totally unwanted or which will infringe upon the privacy. Then the bill should be amended to exclude the storage of the data except for the offenders. And then the matter of data protection is very, very important, and hence before actualizing or effecting the provisions of this particular bill, there should be a robust data protection law in our country. And finally, a separate index for civil matters shall be provided by amending the bill. So this is it as far as DNA technology regulation bill is concerned. Let's now move on to the next news. India does need a fiscal council appears on page number 6 as a lead article. This article highlights the importance and the need of fiscal council in India. According to the author, it is very, very important that the central government of India along with the states abide themselves by the rules of fiscal discipline. So in this regard, it becomes important for us to understand what actually fiscal discipline is. Why is fiscal discipline so important? What are the current issues in the fiscal management of our country because of which a need for an independent fiscal council is being felt? And if an independent fiscal council shall be made, what should be its functions? So let us begin the discussion by first understanding what fiscal discipline is. So in order to understand the fiscal discipline, we first have to realize that the government collects taxes in the form of revenues from us, and it then expends or spends that revenue collected in the form of expenditure in various forms. Now ideally, the revenue and the expenditure should be balanced for any government. But we have seen that in past many years, the government of India is running on a fiscal deficit, which means that the revenue and the expenditure are not balanced. Indeed, in fact, the expenditure of government of India is always higher than the revenues, and hence it requires the government of India to borrow money in order to meet the extra expenditure apart from revenues. So this is just a part of a problem. Having a fiscal deficit is not the full problem itself. But there are other various methods being utilized by the central government as well as the state governments, which actually leads to the understatement of the fiscal deficit. And hence you can say in simple word that the actual fiscal deficit is somehow hidden from the public. And all this is happening because there is no fiscal council present in our country. All this is happening because all the expenditure of the government is approved by the Parliament of India. And especially all the expenditure is a form of a money bill which is controlled by the Lok Sabha. And the government having majority in the Lok Sabha controls all the bills, and hence whatever expenditure they want to make, they are able to get it approved from the Parliament. So we can say that there is no condition and there is no foundation on the central government as far as expenditures are concerned. They are not bound either by the revenues or by the Parliament because ultimately the government commands the majority in the Lok Sabha. So that is why a lot of financial thinkers have suggested that an independent fiscal council be created which shall keep an account of the revenues of the government of India, its expenditure, the difference between the expenditure and the revenue, the borrowing level of the government, as well as the budget approval of the government. And an independent fiscal council, independent of both parliament as well as government, just like CAG or election commission, would bring much needed fiscal discipline into the finances of government of India. Now the question arises that why is discipline in the fiscal management so important? Now first and foremost we need to understand that whenever there is a fiscal deficit, the government has to borrow. Now borrowing of this money or issuing of the debt by the central government severely restricts the ability of the government to finance new infrastructure or to make capital investments. For example, if the government of India takes large loan for 10 years, following 20 years from that, the government will just keep on paying the interest to this loan being borrowed for this 10 years. And hence, the capacity of the government to invest in infrastructure and other such things depreciates manifold. Then, following of fiscal discipline is also important for the benefit of the private sector as well. Now you might wonder that what this has to do with the private sector. Now you should understand that the debt market is limited in a nation, and both the government as well as the private sector go to the same debt or the borrowing market for their loans. Now imagine that both government and a private company competing among the same limited resources. Obviously, the government bonds will get preference, and hence the availability of funds for the private sector will be restricted, and hence to increase the credit availability to private sector, it is important that the government follows fiscal discipline so that the availability of the credit for the private sector is not constricted. In the economic terms, it is known as crowding out of private sector. Now, the next outcome of fiscal indiscipline is uncontrolled inflation. Too much of government debt leads to inflation and reduces the real interest rates. And hence, to control the inflation, it is very, very important that the government follows the fiscal discipline. Now, there is a term known as intergenerational parity, which will be gravely hurt if the government is very, very imprudent or very, very extravagant in its expenditure. Because if there is a high fiscal deficit, then it has to be financed by borrowing. Then this borrowed amount will have to be paid by the generations or the future generations. So it's basically like transferring the current liability to the future generations. And hence, we might spend a lot of money today, but the consequences of such borrowing shall be faced by our future generations, whose capacity to invest will restrict because of our current fiscal indiscipline. And finally, the importance of fiscal prudence has already been given in our constitution in Article 292. which says that the executive power of the Union extends to borrowing upon the security of the Consolidated Fund of India within such limits, if any, as may from time to time be fixed by Parliament by law, and to the giving of guarantees within such limits, if any, as may be so fixed. So Article 292 of the Constitution itself envisages fiscal responsibility in the form of legislation which will oblige the central government to have a ceiling on debt. And you must know that the government has already enacted such a law which is known by the name of FRBM Act or Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which sets various kinds of targets to be achieved by the government from time to time. Now, it is very important that you should know about various targets being set by the FRBM Act. Let us know in the comment section that you know about various targets envisaged under FRBM Act. So far we have understood fiscal discipline and we have understood the importance of fiscal discipline. Now we will see what are the events, incidents and factors which have led to fiscal indiscipline in our country, and because of which today's article lays a special emphasis on a creation of an independent fiscal council. So what are the current issues in the fiscal management? Starting with the low credibility of our budget. You should know that the budget is based on a budgetary estimates of the ongoing year. So whenever you see terms like revenues and expenditures, they are just estimates and not the real figures. They are projections. And hence, the budgets of Government of India more often than not overstate the revenue of the coming year and they understate the expenditure of the coming year. So if this is the revenue of the coming year, according to the Government of India, the expenditure should also be balanced. But the government, using various kinds of techniques, inflate the revenue and deflate the expenditure, making it look like the situation of financial management in our country is very good. But what happens actually after the year is over is that the actual revenue comes out to be much smaller than what was projected by the government because of various factors, and the expenditure or the spending which the government has done in that particular year comes out to be much larger. And this is nothing but our fiscal deficit, the extra from the revenue which the government has to borrow to meet its requirements. Now there is a need for an independent council in this case itself to check the government's overstatement of revenue and understatement of expenditure. There is a need for an independent body like CAG to actually check the government's figures and data and forecast to immediately say that what you are projecting is wrong and you cannot start this new scheme, you cannot make this new infrastructure, or even you can't promise that because of the constrained revenues which you are going to have in this particular year. So there is a need for an independent body which can make these claims. Then it has come to the limelight that in past years the government has resorted to what has come to be known as creative accounting methods, which leads to the reduction in the fiscal deficit for the current year. And one of the term is the rolling over. Now these methods are utilized to somehow transfer or shift the expenditure of this year to the next year. So for example, in the budget calculation of 2019 to 2020, the government has to project revenues as well as the expenditures. Now some part of the expenditure, if shifted to the next year, will make it look like the fiscal deficit of this year is very small or smaller than what it could be. But that does not solve the problem. It just shifts the problem to the next year. So in 2018 and 19 budget, the government decided to shift the fuel subsidies to be paid to the next year. Also, the government left a huge food subsidy bill unpaid, which was owed to Food Corporation of India. Also, we all know that government keeps on carrying out disinvestment process of public sector undertakings. So government has a huge shareholding in public sector undertakings, and whenever the government needs some money, it decides to sell some shares of public sector undertakings, and that is one of the ways through which government manages some part of the revenue. Now of late what the government is doing is that it is asking one of its another public sector undertakings to purchase the shares of another public sector undertaking. So it is just like a transfer of amount from one government account to another, but the government shows these amounts as the revenue or a part of the earning of the government. Then, as we have discussed, non-adherence to Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act targets is one of the biggest reasons. Since 2003, which was the year in which the FRBM law came into effect, there have been 4 pauses in the deficit targets enshrined in it, and there were many occasions on which the targets were flouted. So FRBM Act sets target for future years. For example, when it was enacted in 2003, it set, let's say, a target of 2008 that by that time the fiscal deficit should come below this limit. By 2012 it should be like this, and by 2015 we should have totally eliminated the fiscal deficit targets. But what happens is that, to start with, there are glitches, ups and downs in the economy, because of which the targets are not met. Then there are various occasions on which the government itself decides to voluntarily give up the targets, and they amend the FRBM Act. As soon as the FRBM Act is amended, the old timelines as well as the targets are not applicable, and they are rescheduled with different set of targets and different timelines, which just keeps on postponing the achievement of the fiscal discipline. Then comes the issue of fiscal populism. Now we know, and you must have heard and read a lot about various kinds of promises just before the elections, and hence political class has the tendency to make such promises at the cost of the fiscal discipline, which increases burden on future governments, and it is very detrimental in long runs. For example, so there is a need for an independent fiscal council which can check such promises of the political parties and even the governments. There is a need for an independent body which can ask questions that how do you promise, or how can you even think of keeping such a promise which will have such a huge burden on our fiscal management. Then comes the issue of absence of uniform fiscal consolidation rules for both center and the states. So there are 3 important things which need to be kept in mind. You must have seen a lot of cesses and surcharges which have come into play in past 1 or 2 decades. Now these cesses and surcharges are important because they do not become the part of the divisible pool, which means that the states do not have any share in the revenue being collected by the central government through cesses and surcharges. Now this is against the spirit of fiscal federalism and financial devolution process, right? Because having access to such a large scale resource puts the states in particularly disadvantaged conditions. According to Article 293 subclause 3, there is a constitutional check over the market borrowings as far as the states are concerned, but there is no such restriction on the center. And finally, the states have constraints in managing their finances as the RBI controls their deficit and cannot float a bond on a state's behalf without the center's own approval. So all these 3 factors indicate there is a disproportionate amount of power given to the center, and hence the scope for mismanagement is also plenty, and that is one of the biggest reasons that why we are seeing the fiscal indiscipline. And then comes the issue of limited tax buoyancy. So tax buoyancy is the ratio of tax collection growth to nominal GDP growth. So tax growth rate divided by GDP growth rate gives us the tax buoyancy. So if this is greater than 1, it indicates that the rate at which the collection of the tax is growing is higher than the rate at which the GDP is growing, which is very good. But the problem in India is that although GDP growth rate might increase at a fast rate, but that does not lead to increase in the tax revenues. And hence the tax buoyancy in India shows no stable pattern. There could be an increase of GDP growth rate, but no increase in tax revenue. But even if sometimes the GDP growth rate is not much, the tax revenue or the collections increases. And hence it leads to a problem as far as projection of the revenues are concerned, and hence we need an independent body committed to the projections of such kinds, which is not also biased by the outlook of the government as well. And finally, there is a lack of institutional mechanism for monitoring. Now you might say that there is a Comptroller and Auditor General which audits the accounts of the government, but you should know that that audit is done once the expenditure has already been made, and hence we call it post facto assessment. And that is of no use because money has already gone from the account of the government, and hence one can critically analyze the way the government has carried out the expenditure, but nonetheless it has been done. So there is a need for an independent fiscal council which can enhance the credibility of the budgetary process, which can increase the precision of the forecasting, which can keep a check on the way creative accounting is being done, which can also regulate the non-adherence to the FRBM Act and its targets, which can keep a control over the fiscal populism or the various kinds of sops being distributed by the political parties just on the eve of elections. And finally, there is also a need for an independent institutional mechanism for monitoring the revenues and the expenditures. And that is why we need an independent fiscal council. The main functions of such body shall be to prepare multi-year fiscal forecasts for the central as well as the state governments, which will define the sustainable level of public debt and will also keep a check on when and how the governments are breaching those public debts, and will keep the government away from breaching that particular level of public debt. Also, it will provide an independent assessment of the central government's borrowing as well as fiscal performance, just like CAG does, but it does after the expenditure has been made. This particular body will do such action before the expenditure is done, but when it is planned. And finally, one of the most important functions of such a body will be that government will have to consult the council before flouting fiscal deficit targets, and only when this body allows the breaching of the targets, then only the government will be allowed to breach such a target. Once such a body is created, only then there will be a check on competitive populism, and a much needed transparency in our budgetary process can be introduced. Now this article delves into some of the aspects of recent agreement between Israel and UAE. Now the deal between Israel and UAE has already been covered by our phenomenal Faizan sir, who captivated us with his mesmerizing explanation of not only the deal, the details of the deal, how significant is the deal for Arab and Israeli relations, and how much time has it taken for the deal to arrive, and probable reasons behind this deal. So it is highly advised that you go through this wonderful discussion done by Faizan sir on DNS dated 15th of August 2020. You just have to put this date along with RAU'S DNS into the search option of YouTube, and you just have to click the first result you get in the search results. Now in this particular article, author says that a huge role has been played by United States in order to make Israel and United Arab Emirates arrive at an agreement. Although these two nations have been approaching each other since a very long time, but stigma associated with the Israel is very big, and for a Muslim nation like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates to openly recognize Israel and establish formal diplomatic relations is a very big thing, and also an achievement for US. And hence it is a historic moment for Israel. Because for a long time Israel was a state that no country in West Asia was recognizing. And the normalization of relationship with Israel was contingent upon the fact that whether or not statehood was granted to Palestine. So in a way we can say that the issue of Israel and Palestine was coupled with each other, and normalization of relationship with Israel has always been conditioned upon the fact that whether Israel decides to give all the rights and enable the free and fair movement of the citizens of Palestine or not? And in this regard, almost all the Muslim nations and especially the Arab ones had been united. But the unity was broken in 1979 when Israel managed to achieve full diplomatic relations with Egypt in 1979 and then with Jordan in 1994. Now, if you know the reason that why Egypt had to normalize its relation with Israel, do let us know in the comment section. It has to do with an outcome of a war, an occupation of a territory. And after the normalization of relationship with Egypt and Jordan, UAE is the third such country. And it is an important one because just after Saudi Arabia, it is one of the most influential Muslim countries across the world. So this is the third significant win for Israeli foreign policy, where it has managed to keep the precondition of Palestine statehood off the table and establish full diplomatic ties. So according to the author, the biggest achievement of Israel is not the normalization of relationship, but it is the decoupling of Israel and Palestine issue. Because so far the Muslim nations have said that we will recognize Israel only when the Palestine is allowed to function as a normal and a proper state. And ignoring of the cause of Palestine by UAE is a big shift in the policy of Muslim nations. Now, according to the author, this big shift in the policy of UAE has been brought about due to Iranian factor. We know that Iran has been rising continuously on its own. It was able to resist United States sanctions and has grown closer to both Russia as well as China. And hence, UAE along with Saudi Arabia consider it as a big threat in this region. We also know that Iran has continued to sustain its nuclear program despite warning from America and many other developed nations. Hence, there is a growing concern among Saudi Arabia as well as other Gulf monarchies in a likelihood of a confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia and UAE. Iran might have an upper hand. And since United States is increasingly withdrawing itself from West Asia, Israel is the only possible alternative and an effective deterrent to the power of the Iran. So from a triangular relationship of Iran, Israel and Saudi, where each one of them was an enemy of each other, it seems like now the situation has changed. Israel and UAE are on one side, led by Saudi Arabia, and Iran on the other. Now here I would like to mention that Saudi has made no such deal with Israel as UAE has. But everyone knows that UAE is a kind of pawn for Saudi Arabia. And it's like a test kid. Without the approval of the Saudi, it would be unthinkable on behalf of UAE to take such a big decision of normalization of relationship with Israel. It is very obvious that Saudi has given clearance to such a deal. And that is why we are writing Saudi Arabia everywhere. So does this mean that the Palestinian issue has become a non-issue in this region? So this is not the first time when the Palestine has been decoupled from Israel. We have seen that in 1979 and in 1994, Egypt and Jordan respectively decoupled the issue of Palestine. Although there is a wide solidarity among the Arab people with the Palestinians, but that's it. That's where the solidarity and sympathy ends. The ruling class is not accountable to public as most of the Arab rulers are not democratically elected and often make decisions depending on the situation in the region. So now UAE and Saudi Arabia, led by monarchies, have decided that it is in their own best interest to shake hands with Israel in order to be able to counter the growing influence of Iran, and hence they have gone ahead with it irrespective of the common public sentiments. That's how the Iranian factor has moved them closer to Israel. Let's now move on to the next news. This next article of discussion, The Challenge of Catching Elusive Taxpayers, appears on page number 7. And it highlights the significance of increasing the tax revenue collection, especially in the context of COVID pandemic. Now, The author highlights the collection of higher and higher tax revenues in the coming fiscal years. Why is it so? We all know that expenditures related to pandemic are ballooning each and every day. There is a need for enhancing more and more health infrastructure. There is a need to buy a lot of testing kits as well as PPE kits. There are need for quarantine centers, and finally the vaccines will come, which will have to be subsidized by the government. So these expenditures are committed and they cannot be curtailed. But at the same time, India's tax collection is set to decline because the tax collections are dependent on economic activities. If the economic activities goes down, the tax collections also dip. And hence, this particular year, we know that the national income is going to historically take a plunge in 2020 and 21, which will result in drastic reduction in the revenue of the government. And hence, the fiscal deficit is going to increase many times. And there is no option but to try and collect more and more taxes to minimize the fiscal deficit. And hence, in this context, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has unveiled income tax reforms to make the system faceless, painless, and seamless. All the three steps needed to ensure that more and more tax filers come openly and file their taxes. So here let us first understand and look at the current status of payment of taxes in our country. So if we talk about the income tax or the direct taxes, about 15 million, or you can say 1.5 crore people in our country of 1.35 billion pay income taxes. This was for 2018 and 19 financial year, which was unaffected by the COVID. Obviously in 2020 and 21, this number will reduce drastically because of the reduced income of the people, which will take them beyond the scope of the income tax. Now one might expect that the number of income tax filers will increase with each year. This is not so. Because in 2012 and 13, the number of people who filed income tax was 16 million, which was reduced to 15 million in 2018 and 19. It should be highlighted that there is a difference between tax filers and taxpayers. Try to find out what are the differences. Now the number of tax filers has increased in our country, but the effective taxpayers, the people who actually pay some amount to the government, has dropped. And this is a result of tax concession offered in the budget, because it was announced that people filing a return up to 5 lakh will not have to pay any kind of tax. Currently the direct tax to GDP ratio in our country is about 5.5%. Now tax to GDP ratio is very important because it represents the size of country's tax kitty relative to its GDP. It is actually a representation of the size of government's tax revenue expressed as a percentage of GDP. Higher the tax to GDP ratio, the better financial position of the country will be. A higher tax to GDP ratio means that the government is less dependent on borrowings. And so, India's taxes to GDP ratio is around 17%. Now, this number is of no meaning if we do not compare it with those of other countries. And hence, the average of OECD countries is that of a 35% as compared to India's 17%. Okay, you can say that comparing with OECD countries is not good. So let us compare with Brazil, which has a tax to GDP ratio of 34%, South Africa of 27%, and China of 22%. So India has a pretty bad tax to GDP ratio, and hence India needs to encourage more and more people to file and pay taxes. And hence the government has taken a lot of steps. For example, in 2016, just before the demonetization, the government had initiated an income declaration scheme. Government announced that it had data on 93 lakh high value transactions and would use it to catch people, but this had little impact. Then demonetization was itself aimed to bring out the black incomes, bring more people into the tax net, and increase the tax collections. Then also the government renegotiated the tax treaty with Mauritius to get back to India the money held abroad by Indians. You also know that a considerable part of tax filing process was computerized when e-filing and PAN were introduced. And then Vivad se Vishwas scheme was introduced to settle the tax disputes. So a lot of steps have been taken by the government to ensure that more and more people come forward to file their taxes. But none of these efforts seem to have any tangible impact on tax to GDP ratio. And hence, the government has decided to computerize the process of taxation. Now the automated system will decide who will assess the tax return of an individual. During the different stages of a case, different officers will be involved. And that is why the new scheme is said to be faceless and anonymous, so that no nexus or collaboration can be formed between the taxpayer and the officer involved in passing the return, and money cannot be paid to evade the taxes. So basically, what government has tried to achieve is to reduce the contact between the tax assessor and the taxpayer. This reduction in contact will ensure the reduction in corruption. At the same time, it will ensure increased transparency on the behalf of the taxpayer. Because if I do not know about the officer who is looking at my sheets, I will not be able to pay the bribes, and hence, to start with, I shall be honest about my transactions. However, there are issues in this as well. There is a worry that the software can be manipulated by those who know the system, which is always a threat in case of technology. Technology is a double-edged sword, we know that. And there is an administrative problem as well. The department is grossly understaffed and officers have inadequate time to scrutinize the cases. A few thousand officers have to deal with the lakhs of cases. Now what takes a clever chartered accountant a few months for an under-invoicing and over-invoicing cannot be deciphered by an officer in few hours. And hence, these two issues need to be addressed by the government and especially the income tax department before going into this scheme full throttle. Then finally, author makes a plea or an appeal to the rich of our country. Now you must have heard rich people around you whining that India has such high tax rates. How does government expects the rich to pay all the taxes with such high rate of taxation? Then the author says two things in this regard. First of all, if you compare with the past, where the highest tax rates during the time and the period of Indira Gandhi was 97.5%, that highest tax rate have been brought down to 30% plus the surcharge now. And after 1991, after LPG, that is the new economic policies, and various kinds of acts which hounded the rich have been removed. For example, the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, all these acts have been removed. And hence the complaint made by the rich is not fair. Also, one of the famous reports in 2016 stated that 55% of the nation's income is owned by 10% of the people. So there is no case for the rich to complain. Even after such high rates of taxes, they own the highest wealth. So according to the author, the problem is not that the poor and the middle income people are not paying taxes. Part of a problem is the tax evasion on behalf of rich people. If they pay their taxes honestly, the tax to GDP ratio would immediately be 18%, which will be big improvement itself. The reality is that rich and high net worth individuals are fleeing the country. More than 23,000 high net worth individuals have left the country in last 5 years. So in this regard, author makes an appeal to the richest people in our country to pay their taxes honestly. This article back and forth appears as a column, and this article talks how Pakistan takes one step forward and two steps backward as far as control over terrorism and organized crime on its soil is concerned. And this is all done to first soothe and pacify Financial Action Task Force regulations or FATF, and then finally it crumbles under the pressures of the terrorists themselves. The matter of Pakistan is a recurrent phenomena and of not much importance to us. What is important for us from the perspective of prelims examination is understanding Financial Action Task Force or FATF, which is an intergovernmental body established in 1989 by the Group of Seven or G7, which was earlier known as G8 in France. It was formed with the intention to examine and develop measures which can be utilized to combat money laundering. So just like you write Enforcement Directorate, when it comes to control of money laundering in our country, you need to know about FATF as far as global framework is concerned. Its objectives are threefold: to control money laundering, terrorist financing, and to counter the threats to integrity of international financial systems. It does so by developing standards and regulatory measures which will be enforced upon countries just like it is being enforced on Pakistan since last decade. Now there is a thing known as 40 plus 9. Now it could be asked in prelims examination as to 40 plus 9 means which of the following. So 40 plus 9 recommendations is a set of recommendations issued by FATF itself. It issues a report containing a set of 40 recommendations which are intended to provide a comprehensive plan of action needed to fight against the money laundering. In 2001, the development of standards in fight against terrorist financing was added to the mission of FATF, thereby further adding 9 special recommendations. And hence, this 40 plus 9 denotes 40 recommendations against money laundering and 9 special recommendations against terrorist financing, together to be known by 40 plus 9 and not 49. Now, how does the actions of FATF are carried on? Now, the FATF evaluations are based on mutually agreed sets of rules. The FATF conducts peer reviews of each member to assess level of implementation of the FATF recommendations. So in the last slide we read about 40 plus 9. So these are total 49 sets of recommendations. And a group of countries assesses their peers that other countries are abiding by these 49 recommendations or not. And if not, then on how many counts, on how many criteria they are lacking. And on the basis of that, country specific reports are taken out. And on the basis of that, FATF lists countries in grey as well as in blacklist. The blacklist is a colloquial term, but the official term used by FATF is non-cooperative countries or territories. So these countries or territories are considered to be uncooperative in international efforts against money laundering and terrorist financing. Similarly, placing a country in grey list means that the jurisdiction is under the increased monitoring and scrutiny. It also means that the same country has committed itself to resolve the identified issues and deficiencies within the agreed time frames and is subject to increased monitoring. So when the countries agree that yes, we have a problem, we will solve those issues within the time frame you have given us, that country is placed in grey list. But when the country fails to take those actions and it also denies to accept the lacuna in its financial framework, that country is placed in blacklist, which is known by the name of non-cooperative countries or territories. So this could be just formulated as an option in prelims examination, and you could not know that this is same as blacklist or NCCTS. Next article, reversing health sector neglect with a reform agenda, appears on page number 6. Due to the length of the video, we will not be able to discuss this particular editorial. Also, it does not offers any kind of concrete points either for the prelims or for the mains examination. The notes for this article have been provided in the PDF. If you want, you can go through them. This particular article appears on page number 10, which shows that ultimately the coronavirus has reached to the remotest locations in our country and has finally infected 4 people from the Bonda tribe. Now, Bondas are Munda ethnic groups who speak Bonda language. They are found in isolated locations scattered around Odisha, Chhattisgarh and Andhra Pradesh. But their concentration is very high in the Malkangiri district of Odisha. Let us now move on to the question of the day. The question of the day for yesterday, that is 24th of August 2020 was, which of the following constitutional articles provide inherent power to court for punishing the contempt? And the right answer is Article 129, which is the B. But at the same time, you should utilize this opportunity to look at Article 142, which provides very extensive powers to the Supreme Court for the enforcement of decrees and orders issued by the Supreme Court. Article 130 and Article 131, which can be asked in the prelims examination. Moving on to the question of the day for today, that is 25th of August 2020. Consider the following statements. Statement 1. India's Fiscal Council is a constitutional body. Statement 2. Central government has been able to meet the targets set by Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. Which of the above statement is correct? A. 1 only, B. 2 only, C. both 1 and 2, D. none of the above.